Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. This is a lecture on foreign and defense policy. Part 1, Two-Presidency Theory. Professor Peterson, what is two-presidency theory?
Well, it's a theory that was developed by Aaron Wildavsky, who taught at the University of California at Berkeley for many years. And it seems just terribly persuasive that there are actually two presidents at the same time in office, the domestic policy president and the foreign policy president. So we've emphasized the president's weakness in dealing with Congress over domestic policy. But in foreign policy, the president is much more powerful, much more able to do things, and Congress can only stand by and watch.
What are some of the advantages that the president has over Congress in the field of foreign policy?
Well, Chris, as compared to domestic policy, the president is able to move quickly. The president, if there's a crisis, can decide we're going to do something about that and act on it within 24 hours. Congress takes a long time. It can take weeks or months or never be able to act. So the need for quick decision making shifts power to the executive. And then the president is better informed than Congress. The president has the Secretary of State and the Department of State and all the ambassadors, plus the military, plus the intelligence services to provide information to him about what is happening, not only through the press, of course, but through many other sources of information that are closer to the ground. Congress usually gets things secondhand. So that's a second way in which the president has an advantage over Congress. And thirdly, there's a tendency for Congress to recognize this fact and defer to the president. And it was definitely augmented by the fact that before World War II, Congress was dreadfully slow in recognizing the threat that Hitler posed to the United States as well as to the rest of the Western world. Hitler was advancing through one country after another, and Congress barely, by one vote, managed to set up a registration for the draft. Roosevelt knew the problems and was urging the country to move forward, urging Congress to go forward. Well, after the war, the executive branch had a lot of legitimacy that Congress didn't have. And that lasted up until the Vietnam War. And then, as we'll see later, things change after the Vietnam War. And then the fourth point is that interest groups are relatively weak on foreign policy as compared to domestic policy. We've talked about the iron triangles and the issue networks on domestic policy making. But when it comes to foreign policy, there are some of these groups, but they're not nearly as strong. Yes, it is true that the Cuban community is very interested in Cuban policy, and that the Jewish community is very interested in Middle Eastern policy. But in general, interest groups play a much smaller role. And because Congress is basically oriented towards the interest group community, Congress, therefore, is less concerned about foreign policy. And then there's the fifth point, that the public tends to rally around the president during crises.
Can we talk a little more about that fifth advantage on the list? What does it mean that the people rally around the president during times of crises?
Well, Chris, it's called the rally around the flag effect. It's an idea that political science love to talk about, the tendency of the president to gain in political popularity whenever there's a crisis abroad. And in that red bar at the top, you can see the average effect. 1 month after a crisis occurs, for all presidents since World War II. It shows how there's about an 8 or 10 percentage point jump in presidential popularity in a 30-day period of time, which is really quite a big jump because presidential popularity shifts are usually very slow. And then you can look at specific events in this slide The one that stands out, two of them stand out. One is when the hostages were taken in Iran during the Carter administration. All of a sudden, Jimmy Carter became extremely popular. And he became so popular that he defeated Ted Kennedy in the primaries that, unfortunately for Kennedy, were held exactly at the time that Jimmy Carter's popularity zoomed up. Well, it didn't stay there. It drifted downward, and he lost the election. But he had a temporary rally round the flag effect. And the other example of that is George W. Bush, whose popularity leaps when you have the attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. And he is able to do things that he would never have been able to have accomplished had it not been for this extraordinary leap in his popularity, though once again, he doesn't hold on to it for all that long. So that's called the rally round the flag effect. It's a temporary effect, but it's a significant effect that occurs to the foreign policy president.
Okay, if the American people tend to rally around the flag, do presidents tend to hopefully look pretty good coming out of the crises?
It depends on how long it lasts. So if you have a short foreign policy crisis, that's great for the president. But Americans expect a lot of their president. They're expected to do things well, and they're expected to do things fast. They don't like crises that last for a long time. Americans are used to short wars, low casualties. They don't like long wars with higher casualties. So when presidents don't solve crises swiftly, they tend to get into trouble. Now, if you look at American history, let's take a look at the Mexican War, for example. It did last for 2 years, 1846 to 1848, but we were winning one battle after another in Mexico, and all of that redounded to the advantage of the administration in power at that time. And the Spanish-American War was a pretty straightforward war for the United States, taking on Spain and Cuba. After all, we were right next door to Cuba, and Spain was a long ways away, and the American military power was growing, and Spain's was declining to a very low level. So that was an easy war. Even World War I, despite the fact that it was, and we're celebrating it 100 years later this year, 2014, and despite the fact that that war began in 1914 and continues through 1918, and despite the fact that the number of casualties worldwide was astronomical, never before reached, and was really one of the most horrible wars, the least justifiable of wars. And yet the United States enters that war in 1917, and the war ends 1 year later, and U.S. casualties are pretty limited. And then you go on to World War II, which begins in 1939, and that's a bit more prolonged for the United States, but we do not invade Europe until 1944. And the casualties really only begin to mount in 1944 and 1945, and then the war is over by the summer of 1945. So, yes, the United States is used to winning wars quickly. So here you see the casualty rate. If you look at World War I, U.S. casualty rate is displayed there, and you can barely see it. It's so small. And World War II is in red, so you can see that one. And you compare that to the United Kingdom, which in World War I had a much higher casualty rate, even higher than in World War II. And the French is the same. The Germans have vast casualty rates in both wars. The Russians have astronomical casualty rates in World War II. And Japan has very large casualty rates in World War II. So you see how easy the United States got off as compared to other countries in these two global conflicts.
Can you give me a couple of examples of this point that Americans have high expectations for their foreign policy president?
Well, Chris, the two people who suffered the most were Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson, because Harry Truman decided to protect South Korea from invasion from the north in 1950, and he got a temporary boost in popularity. But that war went on 1950, 1951, 1952. He decides not to run for re-election. His party loses that election, and Dwight D. Eisenhower settles the war within 6 months in 1953. So the Korean War was a very unpopular war after the very first few months of that war. But that's really even less of a dramatic instance than Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War, which had already begun under John Kennedy and continues throughout the Johnson administration, so that by 1968, Johnson too decides not to run for re-election. And the war is the major reason why he loses his popularity. Now, if you look at the hostage crisis and Jimmy Carter, you can see how easily it is for a president to lose this temporary popularity that they get from the rally round the flag effect. So the hostages are taken in October '79, and the president's popularity zooms upward over the next 2 months, and then it starts to drop. And then when Carter attempts to rescue the hostages and the Enterprise fails because the helicopters get lost in the desert in the middle of a sandstorm, then his popularity just absolutely tumbles and he is not reelected. So the longer that hostage crisis went on, the more Jimmy Carter found himself a prisoner in the White House. He had promised the country that he would not leave the White House until he solved this problem. So he actually became a prisoner. He himself was taken hostage, and that was the death knell to his presidency. And we go on and we look at George W. Bush's popularity, and we can see rally round the flag effects here. We can see that he got the huge bump up in popularity as a result of the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11. And there are two other events that boost his popularity involving the Middle East. But otherwise, his popularity steadily drops. So you can see that the one thing that kept George Bush's popularity from dropping faster were a couple of the rally around the flag effects.
What about for President Barack Obama? We know there have been a number of foreign policy crises during his term as well.
Well, he hasn't gotten as much out of these crises, perhaps because he doesn't project a strong, we're going to take care of the problem kind of presidential strategy. He does get a big boost in popularity when Osama bin Laden is killed. But when he withdraws troops from Iraq, which you would think would be a very popular thing for him to do, in this black line you can see it remains very low, and he's relatively unpopular even at that point in time. The red line is higher than the black line on the graph. Anytime that red line is higher, then the president has more people disapprove of the president's job, how well he's doing his job, than approve that. And so you go on to 2013 when you have the Syria chemical weapon crisis and Obama decides not to strike Syria. That was probably a popular decision. People did not want to get involved in the Syrian conflict, but it did not add to his popularity. So President Obama's reluctance to use the power of the presidency abroad has probably made it difficult for him to sustain his popularity. So his popularity in the 6th year of his presidency is roughly at the level of the Bush administration's popularity at that point in time.
Professor Peterson, two-presidency theory suggests that we have a foreign policy president that's much more influential than a domestic policy president. But what is the constitutional authority of the foreign policy president, and what powers does he actually have?
Good question. We'll talk about that in our next lecture.